Thanks for coming out again. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And this is our Green Living Seminar focusing on nature and spirituality. All of these presentations are free and open to the public. They take place on Wednesdays at 5:30 here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation room. Where are we? 201? No? 121. Thanks. I say it every week, and I forgot. Our presentation today will go, again, for maybe 40 minutes or so. There'll be a Q&A. Again, please ask questions in the Q&A. And before I present our speaker tonight, I want to invite you to come back again next week, Wednesday, April 1st, we have the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, denominational leader, activist, and public theologian. He's going to be presenting a talk titled, How the Church Can Engage with the Urgent Moral Crisis of Climate Change. So come back for that one. Today's presentation, titled Caring for the Sacred in Nature, the Role of Cultural and Spiritual Values in Landscape Stewardship, will be given by Jessica Brown. She's the Executive Director of the New England Biolabs Foundation. She has extensive experience with community-based conservation globally, having worked in the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, Andean South America, Africa, Asia, Central Europe, and the Balkans. Before joining the New England Biolabs Foundation in 2009, Jessica was Senior Vice President for International Programs at the Quebec Labrador Foundation Atlantic Center for the Environment. She chairs the Protected Landscapes Specialist Group of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, and she's an associate member of the graduate faculty of Rutgers University in Cultural Heritage and Preservation Studies. She holds degrees from Clark University in International Development and Brown University in Biology and Environmental Studies, and we're really thrilled that she's here with us today. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out on a beautiful spring evening. And I must say I'm really delighted with the theme that the Green Living Seminar has chosen, cultural and spiritual values, or nature and spirituality. And what I wanted to ask the Green Living Seminar students, how did you come up with that? Did somebody tell me? Oh, so you came in and inherited it. Okay, how do you like it? Has it been good? Yeah. It seems it. I mean, just looking at the discussions, I've tried to peruse some of the YouTube videos, and I'm honored to be part of it, and I wish I could have come to all the talks. But anyway, so my talk is going to focus on caring for the sacred in nature. We're going to explore briefly, because we don't have a lot of time for this very big topic, how cultural and spiritual values can be found at the root of conservation practices in different settings and regions of the world. And as I say, it's a big topic. I hope we can scratch the surface with a few examples, and I hope we can have some discussion too. So I'd like to anchor our exploration of conservation and sacredness in nature in the idea of the living landscape. What do I mean by a living landscape? It kind of calls to mind the opposite, right? An inanimate, non-living landscape. But for the purposes of our session tonight, let's consider landscapes through the lens of vitality. In other words, a landscape that supports biological diversity as well as cultural diversity, that is vibrant and dynamic and sustained through a relationship of care or stewardship between humans and nature. But before we get into all that, I thought I might elaborate a little. Professor Traister has given quite a comprehensive introduction, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about my perspectives in this work, because some of the examples I'll be sharing come especially from my work with the New England Biolabs Foundation. And that's my day job. I'm executive director at the New England Biolabs Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation. And as you can see, the foundation's mission focuses on community-based conservation. And we articulate our vision in such a way that we are explicitly recognizing the interconnections between nature and culture and the role of indigenous and local communities in stewardship. well, we're based not that far from here, though it was kind of a long drive this today, in Ipswich, Massachusetts, in the eastern part of the state. But we work mostly internationally, and we fund in countries of Central America, Andean South America, and West Africa. And that map just gives you a little sense. It's kind of a historic reason why we're in those countries, but in fact, especially in the regions of Andean South America and Central America, there are a lot of commonalities between the countries. We provide small grants in support of community-led conservation projects. Because our grants are small, we give a lot away in a given year. We might have upwards of 100 to 130 grants in any year. And our approach is to be flexible and open in terms of anyone can apply. We try to get to know the work of our grantees and to trust their wisdom and their local knowledge. I personally learned so much from our grantees, and I like to say that every grant is a relationship. So in parallel, I'm also a longtime member of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, which is one of the expert commissions of the International Union for Nature Conservation, IUCN. WCPA is a network of over 30,000 practitioners, scholars, and protected areas managers from all over the world. And we develop and provide technical, scientific, and policy guidance, and we advocate for systems of protected areas and conserved areas. And for many years, I led a specialist group on something called protected landscapes. It's one of the categories of protected areas, category 5. And our working group produced quite a few publications. I've put a few examples of IUCN publications out, and I'll be leaving them with Professor Traister for the class to use. Several of us several years ago contributed to a volume on the cultural and spiritual values of nature in protected areas, which you may have seen. And these days I'm also involved with another group which is part of ICOMOS. ICOMOS is a long acronym for International Council on Monuments and Sites, and I'm on an international scientific committee on cultural landscapes. I share all this because these are two different poles, nature and culture. And really in the last probably 15 or 20 years of my work, I've been straddling two communities of practice that often don't, they are concerned with conservation, they're concerned with the landscape, but they don't always talk to each other. So it's challenging, but it's also really fascinating. So I want to start with a story. And this is a story that involves a visit I made to a sacred forest in Ghana about a decade ago. It was a profound experience. I describe it in an article I had shared to be circulated to the class, so perhaps you'll have a chance to see it, and there's a PDF of it, or a hard copy of it there. So this was about a decade ago that I traveled to the small village of Gofiafetoji, which is in the Togo range of eastern Ghana. I was accompanied by one of our grantees, a Ghanaian NGO, and we were hoping to see the community's sacred forest. We knew there'd be a short hike up a mountain, but of course, first, the necessary protocols must be followed. We arrived a little later than we had planned, but we were quickly ushered into the courtyard to meet with the village elders, and they had been waiting for our visit. We had a pleasant conversation, and that was translated from the native language there is Ewe in eastern Ghana into English. And we asked permission to visit the sacred forest. And our request was considered carefully and at length. And eventually permission was granted. So soon we had an enthusiastic group of young people. They're there. These are some of the youth and younger elders of the village, ready to guide us up the mountain to the sacred forest of the village. And off we went. There was an excellent view of the Volta Lakes as we hiked up the mountain, and what a lovely sunset we saw over the lakes. Just lovely, but then it occurred to me that, oh wait, that means we're going to be coming down the mountain in the dark. And did anyone bring a flashlight? No, they did not. And I usually carry a headlamp in my knapsack, but I somehow didn't have it that day. So that was the start of our walk. And again, I was with, incredibly warm and welcoming group of people, but we had never met before. Once we finally reached the sacred forest, we did not pass beyond the entrance side shrine. It was like an invisible boundary, and everyone respected it. They didn't go forward. We stood at the edge and we peered inside, and despite the fading light, I could see that the tree cover of the forest extended over much of the mountain, and much of the mountain has also been farmed. So this is like a fragment, but a large intact forest in an agricultural landscape. It's a forest protected by the beliefs of the people in the village, who are their ancestral but also their present-day guardians. And so eventually, following a ritual that involved offerings of plum wine to the spirit guardians of the forest, we descended into the darkness, jubilant, singing our way down the mountain. And as I wrote in that article, this is a landscape under vital community-led governance. It was precisely due to the strength of that traditional governance that we were late, that we were so late in beginning our climb and even later returning to the village. Observance of protocols and seeking permission, all that takes time. And so do rituals, and so do celebrations. But what a powerful force for the care of that one intact sacred forest in the Togo mountain range. And it's not alone. There are so many sacred forests throughout Ghana, along with sacred caves, rivers, and springs, many of which are similarly protected thanks to the communities who are their guardians. And here is how my Ghanaian colleague, George Ortson, who works with the United Nations Development Program, and he has mapped sacred forests all over the country. Here's how he defines sacred natural sites: landscapes of cultural importance, conserved, protected, and governed by traditional norms, beliefs, systems, and technologies. They're sacred based on the cultural practices, beliefs, and historical antecedents that might have occurred on the site. And I don't have a picture here of a sacred cave, but that reference to historical antecedents includes caves that were understood for centuries to be sacred, and during the time of the slave trade, were often a place of safety for people in the communities when that trade was underway. So there are layers of history that make these very powerful and sacred places. So I share the story of that sacred forest in Ghana as just one example of community-led stewardship. And my husband and colleague, Brent Mitchell, and I have written a lot about stewardship over the years with lots of definitions. And ultimately, I really land on the simplest, which is people taking care of places. It's at its heart about responsibility for the landscape and for the natural and cultural heritage it sustains. And stewardship isn't just management, it actually rests on the intertwined roles of management and governance. And my story of the sacred forest is an example of traditional governance. There are all kinds of ways decisions are made. In that case, the community was making the decisions. And this emphasis on stewardship, especially led by communities and individuals such as private landowners, and you might think in that case of the example of land trusts, which I know are so strong throughout our state and our region of New England. This is part of an overall trend over the past several decades in which conservation is being approached in much more inclusive ways, as in ways that tap knowledge, experience, worldviews of the people who are associated with the place and with the biocultural diversity in that place. All of this requires us to take more integrative approaches than are typical. And that really has to be one that embraces the cultural and the natural values of the places we seek to conserve. And yet, as I mentioned before, with my own personal experience in this field, but you see it across all kinds of institutions and funding arrangements and so on, there continues to be a persistent divide between nature and culture and conservation practice, a real siloing of the two in how so many decisions are made and projects are funded. So it's something we're making progress with. But I think that, and I've often argued that landscape is our bridge between nature and culture. The landscape is, after all, both the source and the expression of the diversity of life on Earth, both source and expression. And living landscapes are, by their very nature, biocultural landscapes, and vice versa. So in this sense, I am talking about places that are shaped by the interactions of people and nature over time. And because of that, they are rich in biological and cultural diversity, not despite the presence of people, but precisely because of the presence of people. And landscapes are places of intersection, the places where nature and culture are intertwined. They hold the past and the present, as well as tangible and intangible values. When I talk about intangible values, they are present in the landscape. We can't see them necessarily with our eyes or touch them, but these associations, such as the sacredness, that's an example of an intangible value. So the relatively recent emergence of the concept of biocultural diversity, I think, has been really helpful in building that nature-culture bridge, guiding us towards more integrative approaches in conservation. I serve on the board of an organization called Terra Lingua, and it defines biocultural diversity as the diversity of life in all its manifestations, biological, cultural, and linguistic, interrelated within a complex socio-ecological adaptive system. Okay, that's a mouthful. Maybe more simply, it can be defined as the true web of life, diversity in both nature and culture. One of the things that has been really important in Terra Lingua's framing is that third circle language, because we think a lot about culture and we think language is just kind of in that circle. But honestly, language is where memory is encoded. It's where the passing of ideas from one generation to another of knowledge, that's where that happens. And when you lose a language, as we are losing certain endangered languages, just as we're losing endangered species, we're losing certain smaller populations languages that are spoken by smaller populations. We are losing essentially a library of knowledge. So language is a key piece of that. So sacredness we often also associate with the iconic, like iconic mountain landscapes that inspire awe in us in ways that transcend culture or religion. Many of us could go to a place like Mount Fuji, pictured here in a famous woodcut by Hokusai, Mount Fuji in Japan, and just feel that sense of awe, no matter where we come from. Or Machu Picchu in the southern Peruvian Andes, one of the most important ceremonial sites in the Incan Empire. It is an example of how cultural and natural values are interlinked with natural ones. This vast complex of archaeological ruins, cloud forests, and sacred mountain peaks spans 33,000 hectares. That's about 75 to 80,000 acres and hosts a tremendous amount of biodiversity. So again, nature and culture. It was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1983 because of its outstanding universal values, both the cultural ones and the natural ones. These places take our breath away. And I will tell you that at Andean altitudes, that's literally the case. But I think they inspire in all of us awe. And I think that's a powerful force and highly connected to this idea of sacredness. Another awe-inspiring image, and these peaks, are they're occupied by spirits, apus, who are part of the decision-making and governance in a lot of the traditional communities there. So we can consider, how the sacred dimensions of these ancient mountain landscapes have inspired their present-day stewardship. One example that I want to share, because it's one of the projects that we fund at New England Biolabs Foundation, And I've had the opportunity to visit it on several occasions. These are projects led by indigenous Quechua communities to reforest high altitude mountain landscapes. And when I say high altitude, I mean like 4,000 to 5,000 meters, which is 10,000 to 14,000 feet. And so not much grows there, but there's a tree called the Kenya, or it's a Polylepis genus. It's in the genus Polylepis that grows at high altitude. And this is a reserve, the Abramalaga Reserve, that's part of a network of community-run reserves in the landscape of the Cordillera Vilcanota in southern Peru. It's an austere and, again, breathtaking, literally high-altitude landscape. It supports extraordinary biodiversity, even though it's not showy and large mammals and so on, but birds, and there are quite a few endemic species of birds, in fact, and many plants associated with this very small Kenya tree. And it's also super effective, the Kenya, in sequestering carbon in the soil, and they're starting to study that. So it's a fascinating landscape, and we're supporting an organization called ECOON. It's an indigenous-led NGO, and they're collaborating with different Quechua communities in the Sacred Valley of Peru. That's literally what that valley is called, to reforest these high mountain slopes. So the Kenya used to flourish in the high altitude mountain areas, and then during the colonial period, these forests were largely cut down. And so, but that memory remains with the Quechua communities, that ancestral memory of the time when it was forested, and they are very motivated to reforest it. And so through the project, they established small tree nurseries to produce seedlings. You can see an example of the nursery, one of the nurseries there on the right, and that gentleman, Goyo in the blue, is one of the staff of ECOON that works really closely with these communities. And they produce seedlings, and then they undertake what they call mingas. These are community work projects to plant the trees on the high slopes. They'll plant as many as 100,000 trees in a single weekend, and they're carrying these seedlings on their back, wrapped in hand-woven blankets, no fancy equipment. The total number of trees planted since the project began, well over 1 million. At this point, I'm probably off by quite a lot, because that number is from quite a few years ago, and they continue the project. So it's an ancestral landscape that's being restored for future generations, and then truly a living landscape. So, we think about, I've been talking a bit now about the forested landscape, about sacred forests, about reforesting, but there are also food growing landscapes. And we know that in so many cultures, there are sacred dimensions, not only to natural features like forests, caves, springs, lakes, but also to foodways and to agricultural practices. And this is a ceremony in rural Guatemala celebrating the harvest of corn and other crops. So short detour from the southern Peruvian Andes, but now we're back. The present day terraced landscape of El Parque de la Papa, or that is Spanish for the potato park, is in Peru and in Quechua community. It's an example of a biocultural landscape under indigenous community-led governance, created by 7 indigenous Quechua communities. These days, I think there are 6 participating in the initiative, and they were concerned with safeguarding their culture, their traditional way of life, and their foodways, including managing the land as it has been done for millennia to grow potatoes and other crops. And so El Parque de la Papa is part of a network of biocultural heritage territories in Peru, and there's a Peruvian nonprofit NGO called Andes that has been supporting them, and all of them have spiritual values associated with them. Again, inseparable from all the other cultural values. So in this case of El Parque de la Papa, there's an ancestral cosmovision or worldview that forms the basis for the community's governance and for their management plan. And this drawing is an indication of that. You can see governance and reciprocity at the center. You see ethics, cultural and spiritual values as one part of their planning framework, as well as conservation, domesticated species and agricultural species. So it's super complex. It builds on many generations of traditional ways of managing the land. And again, as I mentioned before, as in other parts of the Andes, the apus, or the spirits associated with the neighboring mountain peaks, are part of this governance and decision making. They're consulted in these processes, just as they were when we visited the sacred forests. So their foodways are closely linked to sacred dimensions of the place and all that has been harvested from it. Again, no separation between the so-called secular and the so-called sacred. And this El Parque de la Papa has a bunch of different projects that are helping support the livelihood needs of the participating communities. There's a collective of women weavers, and there even is a small restaurant that's reviving traditional gastronomy. And you're eating a lot of potatoes there, but also some of the other traditional foods of these communities, like alpaca and some of the wild greens that grow in association with the farmed landscape. And intergenerational transmission of knowledge is so important to ensure that these cultural and spiritual connections to the landscape continue into the future. And they do a lot to keep the youth and the children involved. But the livelihoods projects that I mentioned before, such as the restaurant, such as some of the ecotourism that they do, are also so important because it keeps the youth there. Otherwise, they're going to leave for larger towns. So these sacred features are found not only in community conserved areas like the ones I've been discussing with you so far, but also in places that are recognized at the global level with global designations such as UNESCO World Heritage. These include landscapes like the one depicted, shown here, which is the sacred sites and pilgrimage routes of the Key Mountain Range. That's its official World Heritage title. And it was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2004. This is in Japan. Multiple associations of different forms of Buddhism, but also so-called pagan rituals are associated with this landscape, and it was inscribed for those values. There's not time to go into the complexity of the World Heritage Convention, which goes back many years now, but it's been a very important framework for recognizing places of outstanding universal value all over the world. And in 1992, an important development was they added one more kind of designation called cultural landscapes. And that created an incredible opportunity to inscribe sites that really show that interaction between humans and nature, and also sites that contain diverse, tangible as well as intangible values. And since 1992, when that designation was added to the list, there have been cultural landscapes from every region of the world added to the World Heritage List. And if you're ever, interested in finding out more about UNESCO World Heritage, it's really easy to just go to that site, Google it, and there's a list, there's a map, and you can click on different countries and see how many sites they have. Some countries have quite a lot because they got in there early, I think, in the process. And put it on your bucket list because they are often some of the most amazing places on the planet to visit. Machu Picchu being a great example. And one of the developments, I was involved with that publication there and the program it represents. One of the developments in World Heritage was recognizing that although these are global designations, it's often the communities who are living closest to it who are caring for these places, and yet they're a bit disconnected. And so there was, in 2007, a recognition by the World Heritage Convention that they should add the word community as the fifth C to their strategic objectives. And these were complementing other objectives that happen to begin with C, credibility, conservation, capacity building, and communications. What's been important about that, again, is that progress with a global designation. So some of the other examples that I've shown you have been very bottom up, but UNESCO World Heritage is as kind of global and high level as it gets, and yet this is a way to ensure more indigenous and local community involvement, and also to bring attention to the importance of locally held values. Earlier, I shared the example of sacred forests from Ghana and West Africa, but of course, they're found all over Africa in many, many different regions. For example, what I'm showing you here is Gatune Sacred Forest. It's a community-managed heritage site near Mount Kenya National Park in Kenya. And then, not depicted here, but another example of World Heritage is the sacred Mijikenda Kaya forests in coastal Kenya. And they were designated as UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. They're actually a serial site with multiple different forests that are connected by that recognition. And then in the following year, UNESCO actually recognized the traditions and practices associated with the sacred forest under a different convention that's concerned with intangible heritage, and essentially put them on a list, those practices as a list needing urgent protection. So all of these intangible connections to the landscape are durable, but they can also be fragile. And that's what that convention was recognizing there. So again, the introduction of the cultural landscapes category has opened the door to increased recognition of indigenous values as they relate to the landscape. And of course, again, this includes inseparably sacred values. And one example is Papahana Makokea in Hawaii, which was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2010. It's one of the world's largest marine protected areas. It's a vast landscape and seascape that spans over 36 million hectares. Doing the math, let's call it 80 million acres, so big. Rich in biodiversity, holds continuing and deep cultural associations for Native Hawaiians based on kinship with the natural world, and that's actually written into the World Heritage language about the site. And for many generations, for countless generations, Native Hawaiians have practiced, and I'm not going to pronounce this well, but ahupua, which is their traditional marine management system that's based on observations and response to subtle changes in natural systems. And that traditional way of looking at that place has been incorporated into the actual management plan for this huge protected area. So very quickly, and close to wrapping up here, I finally want to mention the rights of nature movement. And this has really been growing over the past decade. People who are rights of nature advocates, and it's, again, a growing force in so many different countries, push for state and national authorities, as well as international bodies, to recognize the rights of natural features in the landscape. So this could be rivers, mountains, lakes. The idea that a river has personhood has been adopted in a number of countries, but also certain species. And there's an example of certain species of turtles that are being recognized as having rights. It's a very interesting movement, one to keep our eye on. Worldwide, there have been a growing number of rivers that have been granted this legal personhood, and one example is in New Zealand in 2017. The New Zealand Parliament granted the Wanganui River rights as an independent entity, an indivisible whole from source to sea. So that was one of the first precedent-setting examples, and very important. And on the other hand, and this was reported in a recent article in The Guardian, there's still a lot of challenges to achieving these lofty aspirations in reality. But I think the rights of nature movement has much potential. I'll share another story. I asked a Quechua, that's the Ecuadorian word, that same word as Quechua, really, the same group, but a Quechua woman who was visiting one of our projects recently, what she thought of rights of nature. And our discussion was in Spanish, and she said, well, you people really like to separate between the rights of people and the rights of nature. And we don't see this as a separate thing. We see the rights of nature as being the same as our own rights. But if it works for you, and if it works for these places, then we're good with it. So, wrapping up, let me return to the idea of biocultural diversity that I introduced earlier in my talk. Biocultural diversity inherently is all about resilience and the thriving of all life on Earth. It's almost as my Quechua friend Patricia Galinga said, it is for everyone and all beings to thrive. And in that vision, the rich interweave of nature and culture creates many forms of connection between humans and their environment, and importantly, among people themselves, between us, between each other. Our connection and our diversity is what makes us resilient, and we're all connected, even when we have forgotten that that is the case. And I feel more and more, maybe especially these days, that in the end, that's what we're seeking. Indeed, we're craving connection with each other and with the earth, and perhaps with something bigger than ourselves, too. That in itself is a deeply spiritual question. Our sacred associations and connections with the landscape are basic to our lives, and they are a legacy for the next generation. Thank you.